Hello. Thanks for having me. Really nice to join you in Helsinki and share something of the story of public health renewal that happened in Nova Scotia in Canada, the far east coast of Canada. Um, so the purpose of the work that we went into in Nova Scotia was that the senior leaders, the public health senior leadership team of the province of Nova Scotia, were getting pretty consistent feedback from community partners and civil society leaders that the public health system wasn't working for them, but they didn't understand why. They were getting this like consistent piece of feedback, and that eventually they were like, we have to do something about this. And that was also coming from within the system as well. So they ended up putting out essentially a request for proposals that was put out in the province of Nova Scotia, and what was remarkable about this request for proposals is that they talked about doing strategic planning, but they weren't actually interested in designing a document. What they were looking for was an intervention into the system. I think one of the conditions that made it possible for them to say, we don't want to go into a strategic planning process where we get a document that we stick on the shelf afterwards, there'd been work going on in Nova Scotia in the Tri-District region for a few, probably about 18 months to 2 years before, which had been a highly participatory approach to problem solving on a local level. There had been 13 women in the Tri-District Public Health region who had been meeting for an amount of time, highly frustrated at various different levels of the organization. They called themselves the peas in the pod, and they met regularly to talk about what they were encountering as the issues, and they met secretly, actually. And eventually they decided they were going to take some action, so they called me and a colleague of mine, Phil Cass, got on the phone with us and said, would you help us come in and work around leading change across the Tri-District area? And we were like, that sounds very exciting. Do you have the support of your CEO and the various senior leadership? And they were like, no, we don't have that support. And we haven't asked for it because we know the answer would be no. And we said, well, you should go get that support. And particularly Phil, who was a CEO in a healthcare organization at the time, was like, you got to go get that support. This is too risky. And eventually Carol McKinnon, the woman who was working with us from that group, just kind of laughed and said, look, we've decided that we can't sit around anymore waiting for things to change, right? We have decided that we're going to go for it. And we know that you have some expertise that could help us. Are you going to help us or not? And, both Phil and I were very inspired by that courage and said, yes, we'd love to help you. And that led to a whole series of kind of participatory interventions where we were engaging with not only the frontline delivery of public health, but also various different levels of the public health system in this particular region. And that began to have really positive effects. I'll never forget, I was running a process up with the provincial government in Nova Scotia, and there was someone from public health there. And Carol McKinnon was in the middle of doing a whole bunch of budget reforms, which meant people were going to lose their jobs in the public health system. And she was doing that through a participatory process with all of those people who were going to lose their jobs in the room, working out how they would redistribute the money together. And they were doing that 3 kilometers down the road. And the person from public health who was in the room I was in got a text from Carol, and she had told them to give me a Post-it. And so the woman came up to the front of the room when I was introducing it, gave me the Post-it, and on the Post-it she said, Tim, it's going great. This shit works, right? And so so we began to see a lot of traction on a local level. And so that then led to this RFP on the provincial level that invited us to come in. And so we got to go pitch. Myself and some colleagues of mine got to go present to the public health senior leadership team and the chief medical officer of health, here is how we think a transformation and a renewal of the public health system could look like. And so we turned up and we presented our process that was highly collaborative, highly iterative, that was rooted in engaging multiple stakeholders at all levels of the system so we could see reality clearly. One of the basic kind of premises we were working with is that the majority of efforts at change fail because people fail to see reality, right? So an enormous amount of the work was actually focused on understanding reality clearly before we make the significant decision-making and policy changes. And so I never forget in the interview process, the chief medical officer of health, who's directly responsible to legislature here, said to me, well, how's this going to be different? You know, I'm going to have to turn up in legislature and speak to all the members of parliament and justify this change. You know, how is it going to be different when I turn up in legislature to how it is now? You know, and our response was like, he's like, what am I going to say? Because you're telling me we don't know the outcomes ahead of time. You know, and I never forget our response was, we actually don't know how it is going to be different in terms of what you say, because the purpose of this process is to go out and discover and then design based upon that discovery. But we do know that when you step up into that legislature, you will no longer be standing there alone. You will have a completely different quality of relationship with your senior leadership team and your senior decision makers, and you will be standing on the basis of data that is generated through authentic and significant engagement of thousands of stakeholders. You will not be speaking from assumption anymore. You'll be speaking from direct experience. And he was like, I like the sound of that. And then that's actually what happened. That's actually what happened. 2.5 years later, he was able to step in to government, to the cabinet here, stand up, and as an outcome of this process say, these are the significant changes that we need to see in the public health system, both in terms of repurposing the system, right? But also in terms of like high level structural and strategic changes. And when he was challenged as to how he came up with these conclusions, he was able to say, we have engaged this many thousands of people in Nova Scotia, and this is the aggregated data that points in this direction. We have these civil society organizations and frontline community health organizations, all in support of this proposal because they were part of designing it with us, right? And so the most fundamental change, I think, that was the outcome of this process was that the public health in Nova Scotia at the time, so this was about 9 years ago, it was still heavily involved in frontline delivery and frontline responsiveness. And so what happened was with the public health system in Nova Scotia was completely repositioned further upstream in terms of healthcare and was focused around promotion and prevention of health, illness. And so I think that was the most significant change. And of course, that change then led to a whole bunch of programmatic changes, services, structures, infrastructure, performance measures, all of that rolled out as a significant shift in the repurpose. But that repurpose wasn't something we got to quickly or simply. It wasn't that we got the senior leadership team together and they all sat down and figured that out. That happened as a result of us forming a multi-stakeholder core team that went on a journey over many months. So we had members of the senior leadership team, we had frontline public health nurses, we had civil society organizations, we had all working in a collaborative team together over time to go and understand the system. They were learning journeys. They went out and they engaged with specific frontline organizations. There were large stakeholder events all across the province where hundreds of people were engaged in live events where we were gathering data around the current state of the system and where we need to focus our attention going forward. And there were a whole series of deep dive interviews that were taken, hundreds of interviews of 2 hours long, where we didn't just gather data, but the interviews themselves began to start changing people's minds about the work. And so all of that data then informed the repurposing. Now, it didn't make it easier. I do want to say that level of engagement didn't make things easier. What it did was it made the decisions more informed, right? So it's not that high levels of engagement suddenly like, oh, this is the obvious thing to do. Like it wasn't like that when we did the kind of 2.5-day retreat where we got to really begin to look at system redesign. What happened was it was way more complex than we ever could have imagined. Right? But we were way more informed in our decision making as a result. So I think one of the most shocking things that came out for folks in the public health system, and this was like a recurring piece of feedback across the learning journeys, interviews, and in the stakeholder gatherings, was that the most significant obstacle to the delivery of public health in Nova Scotia were the frontline public health practitioners. And this was very painful for many people within the system to hear, because they all had an enormous desire to be helpful. That's why they got into the public health profession. But the consistent feedback they were getting was that you're the problem. The public health system, as it's structured, and the way the practitioners are turning up, is the most significant problem. And for a significant period of time, there was like, that just can't be true, right? There was just like a rejection of that data because it was so contrary to how people perceived themselves as public health practitioners helpful, But the bottom line was the system and its practitioners were turning up in the community as experts, right? Telling community members how to behave and what to think. And as a result, they were alienating all of their partners and nobody wanted to work with them. So the whole system was becoming fragmented. So that, all of that data then led to this presencing retreat. Out of that presencing retreat with the senior leaders in this multi-stakeholder core team, we then, focused on repurposing public health. That went to cabinet. We got it through cabinet, and then we moved into the kind of developed that team. Then morphed from being kind of like the strategic renewal team, inverted commas. We rebooted the entire core team, took new people in that we had engaged with into the process, and formed this kind of innovation support team. And essentially, their job was to begin to start identifying, based upon the data that we had, where is public health in Nova Scotia doing incredible work, and how do we turn up the volume on that and amplify and accelerate it, and where are there significant gaps, either in terms of services or in training or capacity building that need to be developed. And that was the whole second phase of the project. So I think some of the most significant resistance that we encountered, there's the inevitable structural stuff, right? In terms of like reallocation of money and resources. But I think the most significant resistance we encountered again and again and again was the public health leaders being willing to enter a kind of collaborative, iterative process when actually the rest of the healthcare system was still working in a very hierarchical, command and control centered, top-down approach. So there was this like direct cultural clash between the way the public health system was going through its transformation and the way that the rest of the healthcare system was working together. And so we were constantly hitting cynicism, boundaries, disbelief. A lot of people were very shocked at the level of engagement we were doing, that how could you be engaging people who had no expertise in healthcare or public health and the design of public health. So I think that was one of the most significant things. And then, and so of course that meant that many of the senior leaders we were working with had to go through a lot of personal transformation, right? So it wasn't just as simple as they were going out and working on the system. They were inevitably having to deal with significant changes in terms of how they perceive themselves, how they perceive their peers and colleagues, how they perceived their work, and how they perceived the purpose of the public health system itself. Like, it wasn't easy, I guess, is what I would say. And it wasn't that the strategic stuff was the hardest. It was that it was almost like the internal transformations that was taking place within the individuals was some of the hardest work. And once we began to see breakthrough on that personal level among the senior leaders and that core team, we began to start seeing the true innovation in terms of systems change. So as I think about advice for you as you go forward into your public health work, I think it's very easy in systems change work, which is the majority of my work in the world right now. It's very easy to get caught up in the redesign of the systems, But my consistent experience is that the breakthroughs happen on quite personal levels. And it's only when those breakthroughs happen on a personal level that we really begin to start seeing some of the opportunities or real innovations that transform systems themselves. And so I think it's like, please, as you get into this work, don't just design for the strategy of systems change, design for the personal transformation of the people who are going to be leading it. Because it's actually that the systems change itself is going to be rooted in the depth and quality of transformation that those individuals go through and that they go through together. And so I think that would be my key piece of advice. And that's something we had to learn again and again, was it was so easy to get caught up in the complexity of the circumstance, and not make space for the kind of internal change that was happening within the individuals. And then I think the last thing I will say is that, and this is perhaps a broader statement, is that, significant systems change, I don't think it's like a choice we have right now. I think it's happening whether we like it or not. So we have to begin to start to work with it. Whether I'm working in education systems or healthcare systems, or large government systems, the change is on, and it's increasingly complex, and there isn't necessarily going to be another side. We're not going to get to a point where everything's calm again. So there's something about this willingness to accept that this is going to be inherently chaotic. We're not going to know the answers ahead of time. We're going to be figuring it out as we move. And therefore, we can't rely on answers the way we used to, right? Actually, the thing we have to start relying on is the relationships we have with the people around us. Because we can no longer trust the answers we're getting, because the circumstances around us are changing so rapidly that the answers aren't dependable, right? So we have to keep discovering new answers. We have to keep learning in response to the rapidly changing circumstances we are in. And the only way we're able to learn is if we're building relationship with people who are different than us, right? And who are representatives somehow from across the system we're trying to create change in. So I think it's like, create the conditions for personal transformation, look to build trust in relationships, right? And those two things will bear fruit in terms of the strategic results we will achieve in terms of concrete systems change. The quality of our relationships is going to impact the results we're able to achieve in periods of significant and upheaval and uncertainty. So thank you so much for having me. I hope it's helpful. I've zipped through a 5-year process in 15, 20 minutes. So I hope it's helpful, and thanks so much, and good luck with the work ahead, and thank you for being courageous enough to step up and lead it.